and welcome to ETF Edge, your go-to place for everything exchange-traded funds. I'm your host, Bob Pisani. You knew that, right? On Wednesday, SEC Chair Gary Gensler is going to hold a vote on one of his most controversial proposals. That is a rule that would require corporate America to disclose material risks posed by climate change. President Biden said climate risk is an existential threat and that it posed a greater risk than nuclear war. The ETF community is watching the vote closely because the proposal will provide much more data on climate issues that can be incorporated into environmental, social, and governance ETFs. Let's talk about the implications with Arnie Nowak, DWS Head of Systematic Investment Solutions for the Americas, who also runs several ESG-oriented funds. Also joining us, Dave Nodick, Financial Futurist. I love that title. How about, Arnie, let's just explain to people what's going on. Number one, how's the vote going to go? And simply explain, what would this proposal, if it goes through, require corporate America to do?
Yeah, so fundamentally what we're talking about is rules that stipulate what corporations here in the US have to publish in terms of their emissions data. Specialists go a little bit more deeply. There's Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 emissions, Scope 3 emissions. So basically saying where along the value chain of you as a corporation do these emissions apply? And in terms of how the vote is going to go, I'm going to myself abstain in trying to make a recommendation or a prediction. But it's an important vote.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that Mr. Gensler would not hold a vote that he's going to lose? It sort of makes sense that something's going to happen. Dave, you're shaking your head over there.
Well, first of all, the SEC's done a really good job at losing lately, so I wouldn't put any bets out there at all. But also, I think that this is something that really does need to be resolved. It's been 2 years we've been sitting on this set of proposals. They largely line up with European standards that are already in place. They're largely redundant with California standards, which are already being litigated. So it sort of fits into this ecosystem of greenhouse gas disclosure, which frankly is a good thing if we standardize it a little bit. Yeah. That's really the positive thing that could come out of it. But I actually think there's a reasonable chance this doesn't get a thumbs up vote and go through a litigation process. I think there's a reasonable chance.
You think it's not going to pass?
I think
3-2, right? The Democrats to Republicans.
I don't think this is purely a partisan thing. If you read through the enormous number of comments that this got, 1,000 legitimate comments from the industry.
15,000.
1,000 of which were deemed by Ropes and Gray to be like legitimate, like unique new ideas. There's really good points in there made by the industry about some of the regulatory burden. I think those are going to carry a bunch of weight.
I cannot believe that Gensler would hold a vote that he's going to lose, but it's interesting. Well, let's get into this a little bit more. I want to know. The purpose here is to talk about climate change and ESG here. So there's many climate change and ESG ETFs are out there. We covered this extensively several years ago. Arnie, you run several of them out here. That's why we have him here, folks. He runs some of these. So where does the ETF community come down on this? Are they generally in favor of this proposal, and why?
Yeah, so first of all, for our listeners and watchers, generally speaking, ESG is a pretty broad topic. We talk about environmental, social, and governance-related aspects. We run those funds. Yes, S&P, for example, is one of them. However, it's important to note that those ESG funds don't only focus on climate. We do have some strategies that specifically focus on climate. For example, USCA, it's called Climate Action, MSCI,
and
on
here
the
it
US
is.
universe.
We're putting up the chart
Wonderful,
here.
Thank you. And here I would say the principle applies: the more data that is available and the better the data is, the better it is for our investment strategies. Why? Because the closer the data is to the actual reality, the closer we can, or the better we can adapt our investment strategies to the reality.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Some of this ESG stuff, we've always complained about. You and I have talked about this. It's a little fuzzy, some of the data. It's hard to get quantitative as opposed to qualitative measurements.
Yeah, and a lot of what we're talking about here is specifically what Arnie called the Scope 3 emissions, which is your whole supply chain, right? If you're buying widgets, what's the impact of the widget that you bought? That's a particularly, you can imagine if in a big complex company, chasing every part in your entire organization is a big deal. there is already a data infrastructure set up to provide that. You have to pay for it now. You pay Sustainalytics, you pay MSCI. They give you good estimates on what those Scope 3 emissions are. This would actually make those publicly disclosed and put the burden back on the companies. So I think there's real reason for this data to be out there and standardized. I think anybody on the buy side, anybody who's an investment manager, obviously would like better and cheaper data, and this is going to make for better and cheaper data.
Let me back up a little and ask you, Dave, what happened to ESG? I mean, remember a few years ago, don't you remember, folks? We did these stories, environmental, social, governance, ETFs, they were all the rage. But that enthusiasm has gone away. There's been outflows from most ESG funds. Several have shuttered. There's been investor uncertainty over just how to define and measure ESG. There have been high fees, and there's been political controversy. So, Dave, is ESG still relevant? And if it is, how is it going to redefine itself?
This is a classic case of the old Gartner hype cycle curve, right? So in 2017, we were at the peak of hype on ESG, lots of new products launching, was in the press all of the time. Now we're on that sort of curve of disillusionment where everybody's like, oh, this is never going to be worth anything. Right. That's not true. What's really true is globally, there's still an enormous amount of money chasing ESG. Yeah. If you look at the US ESG ETFs, most of them have one large single shareholder who owns 20–30% of all the shares of that ETF, because they're bespoke for institutions that have specific mandates about either decarbonizing their portfolio or whatever those mandates may be. So
Arnie, is that true for your funds? Do you have a single large shareholder or something?
It's true for some funds, yes. So, for example, USCA, our key climate strategy, we have a fairly sizable investor concentration. But S&P, which is sort of a broad S&P 500 ESG tracker, has a very diversified climate range, investor base. So I would agree with Dave that there are a number of ETFs out there that have a high level of investment.
So your point, I think you and I probably feel the same way. I feel a lot about this the way like electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are going on a downturn now, which says, oh, we have range anxiety. But you're an idiot if you don't understand that that's where the world is going.
Right, it's not like we're all of a sudden going to stop making electronic vehicles, period. Yeah. Of course not. We're just at the bottom end of that disillusionment cycle. We're in the same place with ESG. Yes, some of the assets have flown out. That was obviously all hot money that wasn't particularly committed to those ideas. The performance has actually been there. That's the surprising thing.
Well, I want to talk about what's in the underlying stocks in it, because that's why the performance has been so good. But I guess the point here is that you see these companies doing really well in this particular space. So how do you redefine it? The politics around it have gotten ridiculous.
Awesome.
So here I'm sitting there thinking to myself, well, gee, let's think about it fundamentally. Who is not in favor of a cleaner environment? I vote against cleaner environment. So clean energy, the world is moving in that direction. Number one. Number two, who's not in favor of more diversity in the boardroom? Who wants less women and minorities on the boardroom? I want to see somebody vote on that. So generally, the world is moving in that direction, yet it gets wrapped up in a lot of politics. So how do you redefine or reinvent itself so that it becomes relevant again?
I think there's a bit of unbundling that has to happen. And to Arna's point, right, he's talking about USCA, which is a climate action fund. It's very specifically going after one of the legs of the stool. I think you're going to continue to see the environmental part, the E, and the social part get pulled out into their own funds. Yeah. And governance, I think, is one that's just universally getting better across
Doesn't
the
that
board.
Make sense that this whole ESG, that we kind of glue these parts together, that's what kind of makes me feel awkward about it. Do they necessarily all go together?
No,
I understand
they
intellectually where the idea came from, but I think it's caused problems, don't you? You're staring at me like...
I think the problems is always subjective, but yes, it certainly requires sometimes more explanation than it might need to. But I still maintain that having something like a S&P ESG tracker that focuses only on sort of the top names within each industry group can be an interesting way of investing, yes.
Yeah. But you and I agree. It's sort of, we awkwardly bolted these things together here. And they don't necessarily all
There can both
perfectly.
be an investment problem there, because it's not necessarily the case that your social justice fund is going to be your clean energy fund, and they may actually contradict each other. I think those are just real.
I want to get back to the proposal, Genslers proposal. So the final proposal has not yet been released, but it's going to require disclosure on direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. This is called Scope 1, as well as indirect, and here they are, folks, as well as indirect emissions, such as from generation of energy. Now, it's less clear as whether the rule would require disclosure of greenhouse emissions from their supply chains, as Dave was referencing, and the users of their product. This is called Scope 3. This has been vehemently opposed by many. Now, Reuters has reported that the Scope 3 requirement is going to be dropped. That is not official from the SEC. We don't know that yet. But I guess the question is, how much does corporate America support this? I mean, Gensler, I mentioned they got 15,000 comments, the most ever received.
Does not support this. Let's be clear. I don't think there are very many boardrooms where people are saying what we need is more expense to disclose more about our operations. They're not asking for that. I think
But most of them are saying they are. I mean, Walmart submitted a letter saying they understood why and that they were already reporting most of the information
well, that's the
they
thing
asked
is, for the companies that are in the S&P 500, virtually all of them already report all of this data, or they have very good estimates on the street. Yeah. So from their perspective, it's like, fine, whatever. They don't particularly care.
Here, look, this is Walmart's comment letter. We wholeheartedly support the Commission's objective of facilitating the disclosure of consistent, comparable, and reliable information on climate change and other environmental, social, and governance topics. Walmart has been reporting climate-related information for 15 years and on certain other ESG issues for longer, and they noted that a large part of their emissions are Scope 3, right, in fact. So this is why I'm wondering how much opposition. I can understand why the Scope 3 is eliciting problems.
This is another case, Bob, where we've got the U.S. effectively being the secondary regulator. The reason Walmart has done all of that is not necessarily out of the goodness of their own hearts. It's because they want to be considered a target investment for a Nordic sovereign fund that demanded they have Scope 3 data. Right? So these large companies have already had to do most of this work. So it's easy for them to say yes. The overall tone of those comment letters was negative on Scope 3. If they cut all of the Scope 3 requirements out and only require Scope 1 and Scope 2, then I'm with you, and I think that they probably do get a thumbs-up vote, and it's not even that big a deal.
So assuming that we eliminate, Reuters reported they're going to drop the Scope 3. Let's assume that actually happens, and they leave in Scope 1 and 2 and even soften it a little bit. It'll pass then, right? 3-2?
And it will also have very little impact on anybody because, like I said, most publicly traded corporations, I went and looked down to the bottom of the mid-cap zone. Everyone I looked at, I could pull up a screen that had all of that data already there.
Well, I see a lot of activist groups eager for a fight on this. It seems like somebody is going to sue the SEC on the grounds that they're overreaching, for example. So we've talked about the Administrative Procedure Act in the past. And folks, you don't know this, the APA outlines the rulemaking procedures that federal agencies need to follow. And there's a very famous clause in here called the arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA, which requires that the actions of any federal agency had to be based on some connection between the facts found and the regulations that's created. They can't just make up stuff. So the question is, how successful would a lawsuit be? In this case, corporations are going to probably argue that the SEC failed to establish there was a problem that needed some kind of regulatory action. Or they're going to say they didn't do a proper cost-benefit analysis. They have to do that and explain how much impact it's going to have on corporations and the cost. Or they didn't account for all the public views that are out there. There's all sorts of lawsuits potentially.
Million ways they could do that. And we're living in an era where people are suing the SEC and winning. People are suing the EPA and winning. Right? Yeah. There is a concerted effort to dismantle the administrative state any way you can. So I think it almost goes without saying, whatever happens and gets passed, somebody's going to sue on the APA to try to undo it, because what's really going on is trying to erode the foundations of the SEC's rulemaking authority from the start.
Right. So there's a broader ideological assault that's going on here, independent of the climate change proposal itself.
It almost doesn't matter what rules the SEC comes out with next. If they're in any way a burden on corporate America, they're probably going to get sued for it.
Yeah. And yet the world is moving in this direction. They are moving towards more disclosure because actually it does have a material impact. I mean, I always say if I'm investing in bonds in Miami Beach, I sure as hell want to know something about climate change in Miami Beach. And how does the Miami Beach, are they building a seawall? I'd like to know that. If they're doing that, that's a disclosure on climate change. So this is an obvious one, but that's sort of the way I feel.
I mean, think about insurance
if it's
companies.
Material.
Right.
And then you get hung up on what's material.
Right. But think about what's going on in the insurance market right now, not just in Florida, but in California as well. You're seeing, homeowners insurance getting pulled further and further back, fewer and fewer issuers. These are precisely the kinds of risks that we get disclosed more broadly across industries.
Yeah.
And Bob, I think you made a very important point on financial materiality. Because we're sometimes talking about ESG and it sounds and feels and is perceived as if we're talking about ideology or political topics. No, we're talking about risk factors that can financially and materially impact a company's profitability. So therefore, I think this conversation is super relevant.
Yeah, so these rules are going to have an impact on corporate America, as you said here. So just think about it. Increased costs overall for reporting. Increased litigation risk from both the SEC potentially suing them and from activist investors suing them. For example, can you see an activist investor saying, you know, based on your disclosure, XYZ company, you're not doing enough to address climate risk? So here's just three obvious things here where it can impact corporate America. So you can see why they're pushing back. There's going to be a gigantic mini industry around here. Climate change disclosure committees, just like there is for cybersecurity. Right. Now, cybersecurity has now spawned a gigantic little industry of advisors within corporate America, advising them on how to proceed.
We absolutely already have that in the climate space. I mean, there's a very large business in climate consulting for corporations already. Again, because most publicly traded companies already have to do most of this work anyway, just to be viable targets for investment from big institutions.